There is a place on Earth so small you could drive across its width in under half an hour. And yet, if traffic there stops, the entire planet feels it. The Strait of Hormuz is only about 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, and the actual shipping lanes are even tighter, roughly 2 miles wide in each direction, separated by a buffer. But through that narrow corridor flows a massive share of the energy that keeps modern civilization running. In 2024 and early 2025, more than one quarter of total global seaborne oil trade moved through Hormuz, along with about one fifth of global LNG trade. That means a disruption in the single waterway would not stay in the Persian Gulf. It would reach gas stations, power grids, factories, grocery stores, and shipping schedules around the world. And that is what makes this tiny strip of water one of the most dangerous economic fault lines on the planet. Because the real story is not just about geography, it is about concentration. A huge amount of the world's energy system has been funneled into one maritime choke point with very few substitutes. The US Energy Information Administration says there are very few alternative options to move oil out of the strait if it is closed, and even the main bypass pipelines in Saudi Arabia and the UAE together can only reroute about 4.7 million barrels per day, far below the roughly 20.9 million barrels per day that moved through Hormuz in the first half of 2025. That mismatch is the heart of the danger. If Hormuz is blocked, the world cannot simply detour around it. First, but the most important insight is that Hormuz is not just an oil route. It is a pressure valve for the global economy. When people hear Middle East shipping lane, they often imagine a regional problem. But the energy leaving the Gulf is not staying in the Gulf. It feeds Asia in particular. The IEA says that in 2025, nearly 90% of LNG exported via Hormuz went to Asian markets, and the LNG delivered through the strait accounted for around 27% of Asia's total LNG imports. So if ships stop moving here, the first shock is energy, but the second shock is industrial. Higher gas prices mean more expensive electricity, fertilizer, chemicals, steel, shipping, food production, and manufacturing. That is the domino effect. One disruption at sea becomes inflation on land. The average person may never see a tanker, but they will notice a more expensive fuel bill, more expensive groceries, and delayed goods. Second, international law makes the situation more complicated, not simpler. Under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, straits used for international navigation are subject to the regime of transit passage, which protects continuous and expeditious movement through them. In plain English, international law says major shipping straits are not supposed to become the property of one state's political mood. The legal principle is meant to keep global commerce moving, but law on paper and security in reality are not the same thing. A right of passage does not physically remove naval mines, stop drone attacks, or calm insurance markets. That is why a closure of Hormuz would not need to be formally declared to have global consequences. And if enough ship owners, insurers, and crews decide the route is too dangerous, trade slows anyway. The world does not need a legal closure. It only needs a commercial panic. Third, military doctrine suggests that the most effective way to disrupt a choke point is not necessarily to hold it permanently, but to make passage unpredictably dangerous. This is where the Strait of Hormuz becomes especially vulnerable. You do not need to sink dozens of tankers to create an economic crisis. You only need enough risk to make insurers spike premiums, enough uncertainty to make captains delay departures, and enough incidents to convince markets that future supply is in doubt. The US Fifth Fleet has repeatedly increased patrols and maritime coordination around Hormuz after Iranian seizures and harassment of the merchant vessels, and it has integrated unmanned systems specifically to monitor activity in and around the strait. That tells us something important. Naval planners do not treat Hormuz as a hypothetical problem. They treat it as an active risk environment requiring constant surveillance and deterrence. Now imagine the first what if scenario. not a total closure, not a Hollywood style blockade. Just a week of serious disruption. Maybe several tankers are delayed, a few commercial operators suspend sailings, insurers raise war risk premiums, and energy traders start bidding up future supply. Economic data already gives us a preview of how maritime insecurity can spread. During the Red Sea crisis, the IMF reported that Suez Canal trade in the first 2 months of 2024 fell by 50% from a year earlier. Undaunted found that rerouting around the Cape of Good Hope added distance, congestion, time, and cost, with the Shenzhen to Rotterdam route rising from about 10,000 nautical miles and 31 days via Suez to about 13,000 nautical miles when rerouted around Africa. That was for a route ships could still physically avoid. Hormuz is worse because the oil itself often cannot. That means the domino effect from Hormuz would be faster and harsher. First, energy futures jump because traders price in scarcity. Second, refiners and utilities start paying more. Third, transportation costs rise across trucking, aviation, and shipping. Fourth, businesses pass costs on to consumers. Fifth, central banks face an ugly dilemma: tolerate inflation or tighten monetary policy into a slowdown. And this is where the phrase bankrupt the world stops sounding like clickbait and starts sounding like a systems warning. The world economy is built on just in time flows, cheap energy assumptions, and supply chains that do not like surprises. Hormuz is a surprise multiplier. For the world has some resilience, but much less than it would like to admit. Saudi Arabia and the UAE do have bypass pipelines. Strategic petroleum reserves exist. Some producers outside the Gulf could increase output over time. But over time is the critical phrase. Markets react immediately. Replacement capacity does not. The EIA's latest choke points analysis says the Saudi East-West pipeline and the UAE's Fujairah line together could bypass only about 4.7 million barrels per day. Compare that with more than 20 million barrels per day moving through Hormuz, and you see the gap. The cushion is real, but it is nowhere near enough to neutralize a major disruption. In other words, backup systems exist, but not at the scale needed to make the strait expendable. Here is the second what if scenario: a limited crisis that never technically closes the strait but keeps prices elevated for months. This may be more plausible than a full shutdown. The EIA's March 2026 outlook notes that Brent settled at $94 per barrel on March 9th, up about 50% from the beginning of the year, as petroleum shipments through Hormuz fell and some Middle East production shut in. That matters because oil prices are not just a number on a finance screen. They shape diesel prices, airline tickets, plastics, food transportation, and manufacturing inputs. A sustained price spike becomes a tax on everything that moves. And in a global economy where nearly everything moves, that means almost everything gets more expensive. Fifth, the countries most exposed are not necessarily the ones closest to the strait. They are the ones most dependent on imported energy and uninterrupted trade. Asian economies are particularly vulnerable because of their exposure to Gulf crude and LNG. Europe may be less dependent on Hormuz LNG than Asia, but it is not insulated from global price movements. Oil is globally priced. Gas markets, while more regional, are still influenced by competition for cargoes. If Asian buyers scramble for replacement LNG, Europe feels that pressure too. The result is a bidding war for molecules, ships, and supply contracts. In a tight market, wealthy buyers can outbid poorer ones, which means a maritime crisis in one narrow channel can turn into an electricity crisis somewhere entirely different. And here is the third what if scenario: the financial shock arrives before the physical shortage does. This is how modern crises often work. Traders, insurers, freight markets, and investors react to expected disruption, not just actual empty shelves. The IMF has warned that attacks on shipping in the Red Sea increased global transportation costs and disrupted supply chains, while regional IMF officials also warned that heightened insecurity could mean higher energy bills and borrowing costs. So, even if enough oil still physically exists somewhere in the world, the expectation of instability can raise cost across the system. Markets are not waiting rooms, they are amplifiers. The sixth, there is a strategic paradox at the heart of Hormuz. Everyone depends on it, which should make everyone want stability. But because everyone depends on it, it is also an ideal place for coercion. A state or proxy does not need to defeat the United States Navy, occupy the Gulf, or conquer its neighbors to create leverage. It only needs to remind the world how fragile the route is. That is why Hormuz remains central to military planning, alliance coordination, and deterrence. The presence of US Fifth Fleet forces in Bahrain, international maritime exercises, and repeated patrol surges around the strait all exist for the same reason. Because a few miles of open water now carry consequences measured in trillions of dollars. So, when people ask why a tiny gap between Iran and Oman matters so much, this is the answer. Because the modern world is more interconnected than it is resilient. We built a global economy that depends on speed, scale, and confidence. The Strait of Hormuz touches all three. It moves enormous volumes, it has few substitutes, and it works only as long as everyone believes it will stay open tomorrow. The moment that confidence breaks, the dominoes begin to fall. Energy, shipping, inflation, growth, politics, and daily life. A narrow waterway becomes a global stress test. That is the real lesson of the 21-mile gap that could bankrupt the world. Modern civilization does not fail only through giant wars or dramatic crashes. Sometimes it wobbles because one choke point, one miscalculation, one convoy delay, or one burst of panic exposes just how much of our prosperity depends on a map feature most people will never visit. The Strait of Hormuz is a reminder that globalization is powerful, but it is also fragile. And the more tightly the world is connected, the more a single narrow passage can hold the entire system hostage. If you want more deep analysis on the fault lines, choke points, and hidden pressures shaping global conflict, subscribe now because the next crisis is probably already sitting somewhere on the map, waiting for the world to notice.